Hey, this is Two Girls, One Ghost.
Two girls, one ghost. We are your ghostesses. That's Corinne.
Hello?
I'm Sabrina. And Sven's looking a little crooked today.
But that's okay.
He slept weird. He's got a crook in his neck.
So we've gathered here today because we're all perpetually online, right?
Well, some of us here.
I am on TikTok. And because of that, we discovered a couple of years ago this amazing woman, Piper CJ, who studied folklore
as an
academic discipline and has a wealth of knowledge as to how that kind of influences different cultures and has her own belief system, and also writes books that are in like the high fantasy realm. So we were just very eager to talk to Piper because she just seemed like the coolest freaking person
and she's
ever.
Educated on so many different, she's educated on folklore. So it was really cool for us who have no education in that regard, but just are fascinated with folklore, legends, the paranormal, supernatural, all of those things, to speak to someone who has spent their life studying it.
Right. It's a different spin, a different take than what we're used to hearing.
Right.
And researching.
Absolutely. So we were really excited to talk to Piper CJ. She also, if you follow her on TikTok, is so charming and delightful. And the way that she regurgitates information is so digestible and fun. And it's just fascinating. So
she's a little magical.
She is very magical and whimsical. Yeah. So we have an episode with her that you're about to watch and listen to wherever you are. We wanted to give Piper a shout out for her books. She has so many different books that she's written. I think she also is working on like a children's series or like a YA. What was she saying?
She was YA, but then she was also working on you'll hear about it in the interview.
Yes.
We talk about it.
But she has a fantasy series called The Night and Its Moon, which you can order now. She has a website. We'll link it in the show notes. If you're into fantasy and folklore,
Piper's the person for you.
Oh, yeah. She also has some novellas, one called A Night Without Whispers or Wing and Arrow. They're just like so fascinating. A Year of Tea and Honey. The artwork on these books are also really cool.
Yeah.
But also there was so much information that Piper was sharing with us that Corinne and I were like, we want to do more research. So as you'll hear throughout the episode, Corinne and I will interject a couple of times to add more context to things that she shared with us that we then later on did some research on ourselves.
So enjoy.
We love y'all. Piper, you were telling us about how you ended up in Seattle, and I feel like we want everyone to know because I so admire the fact that you literally just like loved it and you picked up and moved.
Thank you. I describe my life as someone with really high anxiety, as I really don't see a huge difference between going to a new grocery store I've never been to and moving to Vietnam. They're the same level of anxiety inducing for me. So with major life changes, it's just like seeing a bank teller I don't recognize. So I had been living in Vietnam for years and I loved it. I speak Southern Vietnamese. I thought I would live there until I died. And then because of the global panini, they stopped renewing visas. So I moved back to North Dakota, started writing books for escapism. And when I was on one of my book tours, I had Emerald City Comic-Con and a handful of like book events here in Seattle. And it was so cool that I just thought, I'm not a tree. I don't have roots. I can literally just pick up and move. And so a month later, I was living in Seattle and now I'm Seattle-based.
That's amazing.
That is so wild. I do admire just like responding to how you feel. Like you feel good there, you like it there, so you go there.
Thank you. I agree. I think it confuses and worries a lot of people. But I don't know if you guys struggle with anxiety, but I'm one of those people who, if I'm driving to a new location and there's no parking, I will just drive away and go home. So moving to a new city just really felt like it's the exact same level of anxiety.
I also think, there are just so many people who I think would want to do that and then just come up with a million reasons to not do that. I'm one of them. So I feel like I'm already inspired by you and we've only been talking for like 2 minutes. So
by the end of this episode, I'll have you both moving to Seattle.
Okay. I could be convinced.
Wait, have you ever done astrocartography or like looked at your astrocartography chart?
Yes, I have. I love all this. When I was still living in North Dakota, I kind of had this analysis paralysis of the world is huge. Where should I go? And when I had my astrocartography read, she had said, oh, this is kind of funny because normally there are like 6 different lines I would recommend, but most of yours are in the middle of the ocean. The only one that's anywhere near is in the Puget Sound, like the Olympic Peninsula. Have you ever been there? I'm like, I actually just went there and loved it. I think I will move.
Isn't that so wild when those things sync up? People just think it's fun and silly, but like we had last year our charts read and it was crazy accurate. We were like, what is happening?
Yeah. It is one of those absolute crazy I think part of the reason that people think it's silly is because men seem to feel like they control science, but maybe if they bled out of their dicks whenever the moon was in waxing gibbous, then they would start paying attention to the stars too.
I agree.
That was the most beautifully said diss in the world. I also think because I have gone through phases where I definitely have questioned astrology. And I think it's because I've had such a small scope and understanding of it, especially with horoscopes and how broad it is. I was like, how can that relate to everyone in Virgo, But then when you really look at your specific birth chart and, your rising, and I don't know all the logistics, but when you look at all of that and take all of that into consideration, it's so niche and so specific that I think it's hard to ignore.
Mm-hmm. And I just feel like with so many of these things, magic is just science we don't understand yet. Back in the day, it was that evil witch gave me moldy bread and then my leg was healed and I didn't perish. Let's burn her at the stake. And she just didn't know that she'd discovered penicillin.
Right.
She just had this apothecary. So it's one of those things where maybe thousands of years from now, we'll have very clear connections. Well, obviously, I mean, you dated him. He's a Leo. Oh my God, whatever. But for now, it just seems
I'm a Leo,
anecdotal.
Piper.
I love Leos.
But I'm not a man. Male Leos and female Leos, they're different, right?
I've never met a female Leo that I haven't loved.
Wow.
Okay, good.
What are you?
I'm Aquarius, Sun, and Moon.
Okay. Wow. I'm a Virgo and Pisces.
I'll take it.
Piper, we're really excited to talk to you because we discovered you on TikTok, as so many people have. And for years, we've talked about all sorts of paranormal, supernatural, folklore, legends. And I think it's impossible to talk about the paranormal without talking about folklore. But when we discovered you, you just have this really amazing way to speak about it. And you also have a degree that allows you to talk about it with such confidence and knowledge. Yep. Gotta show it.
Paper proof, baby. Bring them out.
But it's just exciting to talk to you because, Corinne and I are not professionals by any means. We have no degrees in any paranormal studies. And so it's fun.
Yeah,
we're excited.
We have degrees, just not in paranormal studies.
Yes. But it's exciting to talk to you and pick your brain a little bit.
How did you learn that this was a degree?
So the answer might be offensive to religious listeners, but I grew up in the church in a very high control subsect of the evangelical church. And so I was getting my master's in Christian apologetics. And apologetics is the defense of and ability to give the right answer for everything. And the more that I studied, the more that I was like, this is very curious. And I loved my demonology class and my Cults of America class. And I wrote a paper for the Cults of America class that I submitted to a folklore department when I was questioning the church and wanting to leave the church. And they accepted my cults paper and gave me this full grant and research funds. So I just, again, picked up and moved. I moved to Newfoundland and got the 2 years master's. And people say that a lot, how can I get a certificate in the metaphysical? I'm like, well, that's not what this is. Folklore is an academic discipline. So it's more like micro-anthropology, belief of the folk, a very non-structured form of religion. And now I am not only not religious, but I actively write pro-demon media. And I'm a huge fan of cryptids and fae. But how did I just, I guess I really discovered folklore when we were trying to disprove everything around us in these religious studies programs. And the more that I studied, the more I'm like, I actually feel like we are the bad guys.
Well, and also folklore is such a huge topic. Every single culture has quite a bit of folklore in their past and in their present. So when you studied it, did you get to pick a track or a discipline, or what was the direction? How do you absorb all of that information?
Yeah. That's an excellent question. And I actually feel like a lot of people who are inspired by my TikTok and then apply to folklore departments around the world are going to be kind of disappointed because the classes aren't sexy. It's not like Bigfoot 101. And then you all just get to watch grainy Bigfoot footage for your class. It's more like...
I want to start that. I'm going to apply to be a professor at one of the schools.
So instead, it's belief of the folk and and how people make sense of their things. And so we would do these things like, how have women given language to feelings of entrapment? And one of the ways that surfaces is through like selke lore. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with selkies, the seal women, but they're a favorite topic of mine. It's primarily the Nordic Isles and Scottish Isles and Wales. And you find legends of the seal women, and they're women who, when they take off their seal skin, they can walk among the humans. And men will frequently be like, oh, what a sexy lady. If I hide her seal skin, she can't return to the ocean. And then she's stuck with me and she has to be my bride. And so there's this legend of the Selkie bride, which is given us a way to talk about, I'm in this marriage against my will. I really hate this fucking guy. And it also gives men a way to explain away, like if their wives pick up and leave, it's like, listen, I loved her, but she was a Selkie. She was always bound to return to the ocean. And it gives children a way to like my mom left the family, but she had Selkie blood. And so you can't hold it against her. And it's just like the ways that we make sense of the world around us is through a lot of these folk legends and cryptids and fae.
I think that's so cool.
All right, pause.
Okay.
What the hell are selkies?
Thank you for asking. Piper brought selkies up and we were like, okay, need to know more. Like human seal shape-shifting women.
Yes.
But also it's not just exclusive to women. There are male selkie as well. So I did a little research, and they are mythological creatures that can shapeshift between seal and human forms. And the word comes from the Scottish word that means seal. These mythological beings originate in the Northern Isles of Scotland. In a lot of the lore, so there are various different types of seals. And there's this one gray seal in the Northern Isles of Scotland that's really large. But selkie, specifically when it comes to the mythological creatures, refers to seals that are much larger than that gray seal. So it's like they are known to be very large.
Okay, so it's very clear that it's not just a seal. They're a beast of their own.
Exactly. And then, I mean, there's so much about folklore, but there's this man, Radar Thoroff Christiansen, who has a classification of migratory folk tales, which I was like, I want to learn about this man. But so basically, the tale of the seal bride and the selkie have been classified under the swan maiden type.
The swan maiden.
Yeah.
Well, now I'm like, what's a swan maiden? This is just going to be, I'm just going to keep falling down the rabbit hole.
So many rabbit holes. And then also like in the classification system, it was like, I don't know the exact number, but it was like IA4K. And I was like, what is this classification system?
Jeez.
It's like a Dewey Decimal System for
a whole new world.
For folktales. Yeah. Okay. So in this classification, there appear to be hundreds of similar legends from Ireland to Iceland, all the way to Norway. And while the origins do depend on who study and analyze the selkie, there's one belief, and it's a little bit ableist, but I think it was like back in the day before modern medicine, when people were born with like abnormalities, thank you, or like physiological conditions that couldn't be treated, they would blame fairies or fae. And there was this one clan called the McCordum clan of Western Isles who apparently had a hereditary growth of skin between their fingers, so like very web-like hands. And in order to explain why that happened, they came up with this lore of their clan that there was a fisherman who made a pact with a selkie and like mated together. And that's why this whole clan of the family has this hereditary condition.
They descend from selkie.
Yeah.
It's not every day that someone makes up a lore saying that they claim to be of the creature that sometimes people are afraid of.
Exactly.
So that's kind of cool. They're like, oh no, I think I'm related.
We're like magical beings. Because in that area, there's different types of folklore and mythological creatures. Like there's fin men, there's mermen, and all those things, that there has been some convoluted over time. Like they've become mixed up.
Yeah.
But there is a belief that shipwrecked Spaniards were washed ashore and their jet black hair resembled seals. And that's where selkie came from. But there's also another lore that selkies are said to be supernaturally formed by the souls of drowned people, which is really like devastating.
That is sad.
And then one of the more popular tales when it comes to selkie is about a man who steals a selkie's sealskin, forces her to marry him, and hides her sealskin from her so she can never return home to the ocean.
Oh my God. What an evil creature
that
man is.
Yes.
The creature being the man, the human man.
And then sometimes she'll bear children, but her entire life then like she's held in captivity seeking and trying to find where he hid her sealskin.
Jeez.
But then male selkies, so that's a female selkie. Like a lot of them, it's like they become the bride.
Yeah.
Male selkies are described as being very handsome in their human form and are very seductive. They typically seek those who are dissatisfied with their lives, such as married women who are waiting for their fishermen husbands who are out at sea.
Or perhaps the Selkie ladies who are kidnapped by the human man.
Oh, there was one version where the Selkie could only assume human form once every 7 years because their bodies were like housing condemned souls. So it was almost like a mythological punishment. If you like think back to like Greek gods and like the punishments that they would give to humans and trap souls, and then it's like they only could go visit Earth every however many years.
Right.
And so then there's some version where it's like, okay, if you believe in that version of a Selkie, is it a way to teach a lesson about sins and wrongdoings?
So most of the Selkie lore has to do with some sort of teaching or explanation as to why a certain relationship you have is happening.
Sure. Or like why there's a certain physiological condition that you have. And then there was a superstition around Selkie throughout the Scottish Isles where Scots would kill seals to make use of their skin and blubber. But apparently, if you accidentally killed a Selkie, you would have a lot of misfortune. So basically, I think what happened is like as people were killing the seals, if one person killed a seal and then experienced a lot of misfortune, they would then associate the seal that the man had killed with it being a Selkie, like that he hadn't actually killed a seal. It's just like coming up with reason behind why something might happen.
Behind everything.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Why is life not perfect?
Right. Which I think is so interesting that we still do that today. Like, I think it's more in a religious aspect where like, God has a plan for you. Like, you know, like
everything happens for a reason.
Everything happens for a reason. Whereas
time will tell.
Back in the day, it was like, must be the Fae.
Yep.
Must be this creature that we offended or hurt in some way.
Right. Even Piper talks about it. She references a couple times throughout this episode the discovery of penicillin and the confusion about witchcraft relating to one another.
Right.
So,
yeah.
All right. Well, that's a Selkie.
That's a Selkie. That is a very brief synopsis of a Selkie. And there's also so many iterations of it and tales throughout time. We had to know more.
Had to.
One of the tough things that I've found in doing like research for a lot of the topics we've covered on our podcast is finding the source, because a lot of like we are big believers in cryptids and, you know, all the mystical, and like we fully believe the paranormal, like ghosts are real and they exist. But there are some legends that like you're like, okay, what was happening in society when this came about? And if you look at like Krampus and even like the naughty and nice list, things like that. And I think those are just relatable ones. It's like a lesson to teach kids to behave, you know, but on a broader scheme, I think it is hard to find the origins of a lot of folklore and legends. And so how do you go about doing that when you're studying it?
There are two pretty intense schools of thought when it comes to like folklore and origins. And one is, you know, the website Snopes that like disproves things. That was founded by folklore graduates. They have folklore degrees and they believe in like there's core origins and there is truth. And then there's the other subsect of folklorists that I belong to who believe that we absolutely are not here to disprove anything. So sometimes people will ask me like, oh, do you struggle listening to this media because they're not giving the real story? Like, there is no real story, because 30 miles down the road, you could both be experiencing the same cryptid and you're giving two accounts of the same event. That doesn't make one of them true and one of them false. You're both reading your experience, or your terror, your sense of fear is different from someone else who was just curious or looking. And I don't really believe in like one core origin legend. I think it's more interesting to look at the world and see all of the commonalities that we can piece together, even though they're sometimes called different things or called by different names in different countries or cities or regions, but they have the same power, same ability, or arrive around the same time. And that to me is a lot more compelling than trying to find, well, actually because of Oily Josh, who lived in San Francisco and he used to put on a hat and dance down the street. And that was the core.
There's also a game, like an element of like the game of telephone where if things are passed down orally through families or whatever, it can change and shift throughout time.
Yeah. And then in our own research, we found it sometimes challenging, especially when dealing with some of the like cryptids or spirits that are associated with native cultures here in Northern America, because so much of the time, the first time it was ever written down was in a book that was written by a man who was white. And so it was like, well, is this the actual depiction of what this legend is or what these people were experiencing? Or is this a
whitewashed version,
fictional account of it that this person created?
There are so many versions of that. The first one that comes to mind is one that we prefer not to speak the name, but we'll just go ahead and like bleep it on the podcast for the and that lore. The origin of it being cannibalization and savagery was the whitewashed colonizer version that looked upon natives with this lens of less than human. When we actually look at this lore, when it comes from indigenous people, it had a lot more to do with malevolent spirits and greed. And it was a more important life lesson. And then once those colonizers on stolen land took over the lore, it had a very different nature and this very damning, problematic roots. And so whenever I'm talking about indigenous folklore, I'm usually pretty clear to say, like, I am not the most qualified to tell this lore. It's important to look at these maps of the stolen land that we are on and residing on. And here are some indigenous folklorists worth following. But also, I think it's really, really important that we can and should engage in cultures that are not our own and be reading and listening, because otherwise we perpetuate cultural erasure. And I don't think it's safe or smart or wise or woke to only partake in the culture that you belong to, because that's how we create this like echo chamber.
I totally agree with you. So when you're writing your books, how does all of this knowledge of folklore and all of these creatures, these spirits, the cryptids and whatnot, how do you bring that into your writing? How much of it is based in the reality of, like, I guess, our oral histories or what folklore is, and how much do you just come up with based on being inspired by these things?
Yeah, I'll preface this by saying, I swear to the gods, this is not an ad. I'm going to answer you straightforward. The existing series, I think by the time this episode comes out, all 4 books in The Night and Its Moon will come out. And that was inspired by me wanting to write a story with a succubus lead, because I love succubi and incubi lore.
Me too.
Good. I could talk about them for forever.
We've talked about Incubus and Succubus before, but just wanted to give a little recap as we're talking about it here with Piper. Mm-hmm. These are entities you don't want to encounter.
Usually not, which is interesting that in this conversation, there was a lot of love given towards the Incubus and Succubus.
And I'm pretty sure in Piper's books, it's very like Incubus, Succubus, sex demon stuff. Like,
yes.
Which, listen.
But in the context that we know about Incubus and Succubus.
There's like sex with spirits, and then there's demons who come and non-consensually take advantage of you. Yes. And that is what commonly incubus, incubi, succubus spirits are known to do, is that they appear and they have sexual intercourse with people as they sleep. So probably not ideal. There's like some belief that they're actually the same entity, like incubus and succubus is one type of demon, but that can change genitalia depending on who they're attacking.
Because succubus often references this sort of demon with female genitalia.
Yeah.
And then incubus would be male genitalia.
Yeah, exactly. We talked about the movie The Entity, which was based on a true story of a woman named Carla Moran who was living in Los Angeles with her children and was like being attacked by an incubus demon. And they caught like all these orbs. They made it into a movie called The Entity. And I covered it and I couldn't for the life of me find what episode it was. But that's a really good example of a story where an incubus spirit attacked a woman and it was not so sexy and hot.
But in Piper's books,
it's hot.
It is.
It's steamy. Listen, if it's consensual, all about it. You do you.
So if you like about succubus lore and all of those things and want them in a high fantasy world, then I cut my teeth as a writer in high fantasy. The book that comes out in May, though, and again, this sounds like a plug, but hang in there with me.
Also, like, you should be plugging yourself. Like, you are incredible. We want you to.
Thank you.
And also, we asked. So it's not like this is coming out of
you did
left field.
This one is like my soul's series, because what I think that will resonate with y'all and hopefully with the listeners is that we don't believe that ghosts are like, oh, that's something that happened in the 1800s and now no one experiences it anymore. Like all of the shit that went down continues to happen. It's just that we tend to think about words like folklore as if it's old. So the No Other Gods series, the first book is called The Deer and the Dragon. It takes place today, the year of our Lord 2024. And the concept is from no other gods comes from thou shalt have no other gods before me implies the existence of other gods, because you can't put gods before you that don't exist. And if those other gods are real, then things from their pantheons would be real, like those fae, those cryptids, those demons, those angels. And so how would that look if you were possibly a human who you could see through the veil? Some of us would look at that as like clairvoyance or mediumship. But if you grow up in a religious environment, like our MC does in this book, her mom was just like, you see angels and demons, and that means that you are evil and you're bad. And so the rejection of that is telling yourself like, nope, I am crazy and none of this is happening and I refuse to see any of this. And I think that we gaslight ourselves because it's a lot more comfortable than opening up to like, if I have to start believing in this, that could fuck up my life and change a lot of things in a way that I'm not open to. So getting to explore that through this series.
Right. Especially if everyone around you is telling you that that's wrong. Like you don't want to be more isolated. You already feel, crazy. We have a lot of listeners who have experienced that.
Yeah, I really hope that I had a marketing meeting this morning and they were like, who's your target audience? I'm like, absolutely everyone. I kind of feel like
Humanity,
the people who liked things like Twilight just because she was a human girl in a modern society and the idea that a vampire could be going to school with you, but for adults who are like, I believe in this stuff and I believe that it's here and it just isn't being portrayed in a way that feels accessible. Right. And so there's such a low barrier for entry in the No Other Gods series because it's you open it up and it's like text messages, it's today, it's all this stuff going on. I think you'll love it.
Oh, I'm excited to read it.
I'll put one in the mail for you guys.
Oh my gosh.
Wow. Thank you.
That's so kind.
We should make it our next book club book, Corinne.
Do it.
We do a quarterly book club on our Patreon and we're reading A Court of Thorns and Roses. This was our first entry into the fairy sort of fantasy fairy smut world. And I think everyone really liked it. So there's definitely going to be more stuff like that. So we definitely will read yours in one of the upcoming.
I have one more answer to your question, and that's that, like, obviously this one is for adults. This is for grownups. This is which we are. But there are a lot of cryptids and fae who have canon lore where they can and do have children with humans. And so I have this middle grade series, and middle grade is the genre that Harry Potter is and Percy Jackson. But it's just like, what would that look like if you had fae lineage? And that comes out with Penguin this fall. It's a Fern School for Wayward Fae. So we're dealing with all of our different cryptids and fae. And
I want to read that one too.
Me too.
Yeah. I really think like the stories that can only be enjoyed by children aren't stories worth telling. So I wrote it for everyone. Like as young as 8, but as old as 80, I think you'll really enjoy this. Right. And there are a lot of elements that go into whether or not you could have fae lineage. Oh, the crows found me. I'm sorry. I know we're recording a podcast, but
wait, do you have crow friends? Have you made connections with crows?
As soon as I moved into my last place, I had crows within the first few days that came and found me, and they would come like directly to me. And I've just moved to this new place within the last few weeks, and I took a poll on my Instagram story, like, how long till I have new crows? And now there's one on my porch, and I knew you
magical.
They'd find me.
I love the crows.
You got to give them their peanuts.
Yes. Crows are supposed to be one of like 2 or 3 animals that can come and go between the veil and the underworld and our world. And so this is part of, I think, why we're so drawn to them.
Okay, let's pause really quick because I feel like we're very eager to talk about how cool we think crows and ravens are.
Yes.
Without adding more context as to what they mean.
Yeah.
Because they are kind of a symbol of the spookiness of the occult of Halloween.
Very much so.
You know, there's a caw, caw
and like
on the gravestone. And
Edgar Allan Poe, the raven. Totally. Yeah. And we love them.
We do. We want to befriend them.
I would love to have pet crows. And Piper kind of has a pet crow.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah. It lives outside, but it visits.
But we're going to give you, just very briefly, the difference between some crows and ravens as it pertains to the topic of spookiness and the symbolism.
Because they are often confused. And I think if you like just saw a blackbird on the road, you might think crow, but it might be a raven. Mm-hmm. And also, it does make me sad because I feel like they get bad reputations. Like, they seem like they're bad omens.
Well, because movies depict them as such.
Right. But they're not, you guys. They're not.
The opposite.
Crows specifically represent transformation, positive changes, and intelligence because crows and ravens are some of the smartest birds. Seeing a crow is generally considered a good omen. It can mean temporary and unexpected changes are coming, but the outcome will be positive. I learned that crows and ravens' intelligence is on par with chimpanzees.
Wow. Dang.
Yeah.
Ravens, I think, are technically ranked slightly above crow.
I feel like we're going to battle it out right quick.
Well, you could have picked raven. You said you wanted to raven.
I did. I wanted crow. They're smarter than crows?
They're extremely, yes.
Oh.
And they're both just extremely smart. They remember people's faces, so don't wrong them.
Yeah, don't.
They'll come for you.
They also have the ability to communicate with other birds of their species to let them know whether or not you're safer or not. Like one crow might have a bad interaction with you. He'll tell all his friends and be like, watch out for that bitch.
Yeah. Ravens will too. And they might do it in a Boston accent because apparently ravens actually have regional dialects. They literally have accents.
Amazing. I love
so
that.
Funny?
Well, don't like whales and dolphins too?
Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
They do. It is really interesting.
That's so wild.
Crows are basically good omens.
Yeah.
Ravens are essentially the same. Ravens feel ominous because they've been depicted as such, but really some believe that they are messengers of untold visions and prophetic messages, and that they're actually shape-shifting gods and goddesses, and they drive us, they encourage us to discover the truth and embrace and embody the magic that already exists within us, within our souls. So essentially they're like partially messengers of the underworld-ish, but they're also super adaptable. They're very resourceful, and that they can lead us to a spiritual awakening.
I love
is the best way maybe to say it.
Forget collecting crystals. Let's collect crows and ravens.
I know.
We're
trying.
A little bit messier to clean, but
yeah.
I don't know.
I did write down just a couple things to help us discover what we're actually seeing, if it's a crow or a raven.
Okay, thank you.
I say this, I'm not sure if it's going to help at all. But ravens and crows, they look quite similar to one another.
Do. Yeah.
But ravens often travel in pairs. So if you see a duo, it's probably ravens.
Okay.
If you see a group, a murder,
it's
crows.
Yeah.
Crows go, caw, caw. Ravens kind of sound like that, but it's more of like a, like they got some spit in the back of their throat. They're like,
they're from Boston.
They're rolling their R's.
I think their beaks are different sizes too. Crows have...
The ravens come down. They tilt a little bit more down. They're hooked.
Well, crows are slightly hooked, but they have stiff bristles over the nostrils and they're fairly large, almost 2 inches long.
I also feel like in looking at photos, I felt like crows kind of were a little bit more... I feel like they're feather-wise, they had a little more...
Tuft?
No, I almost feel like they're a little more put together.
Oh.
Like I feel like raven looks like it just got out of a street brawl.
Crows do some...
Crows are manicured.
Manicuring.
Ravens just came from the underworld, so they've been through some interesting jet streams.
Yeah.
Crows will also constantly or consistently flap their wings. Ravens tend to soar. And those are the bird facts for
I have more, though. Okay. Well, we've talked about this before, but crows hold funerals, which I think is like one of the most like beautiful things that you could witness.
Wait, did you hear that it might not actually be truly a funeral?
What do you mean?
So we've thought for a long time that crows hold funerals as like a opportunity for them to mourn their lost brother.
Yeah.
But now people are starting to think that perhaps it's not a traditional funeral, that there's actually a murder investigation going.
That's even better.
Yeah, they gather together to survey the land, survey the body, and try to figure out what killed the crow.
That is so sick.
Yeah.
Crows, so their brain to body ratio is the largest of any animal. It's even like our brain to body ratio is smaller than theirs is. Their brains are really massive.
Cool.
It's so cool. Crows and ravens, not bad omens. They're misunderstood. I love crows. I have a crooked foot crow. Well, actually, there's like 6 crows in my yard. I just think they're so fascinating.
I have one that had a sore foot as well. And so I looked into a lot of those, how to take care of crows. And the animal rehabilitation centers had recommended dog food is a lot more nutrient dense. So if you're worried about your crow not being able to hunt because it's injured or in some capacity, then that kibble is really good for them. And
I'm definitely going to use this to start baiting the crows to come into my yard and be my friends, because So far, they've just flown overhead and they're not responding to me, just waving and seeming like a wild woman below them, like, come here, come here.
You should spend more time outside when it's warmer and then like let them get used to you.
Put something shiny, put some cool like trinkets and then the food near it so that will draw their eye and then they have a reward as well.
Have you heard about the crow that stole a knife from a crime scene in Canada?
No.
Oh, Canuck the crow.
Yeah.
He wields a knife.
Yeah.
And he scares people.
He really would say, snitches get stitches. This is not going to evidence, bye.
No, this is mine now.
He steals weed. He gifts weed. He does interesting things.
I want to be friends with Canuck. Where in Canada is this?
I don't know. Are you up and moving again?
Is this Vancouver? Because I could lure him down.
That's true.
We'll figure out the details and tell you.
Thank you.
If crows have the connection to the underworld, are there other animals or beings within the folklore realm that are said to kind of come and go very frequently?
Yeah, so crows are big come into between here and the underworld, and then deer are the ones that come in between the human realm and the veil where the fae are, like the fairy realm. Oh, we have a kitty cat.
This is Leia.
Hey, Leia. No, she's gorgeous. She was like, excuse me, you're talking about animals and which ones have connections to magical elements because I have something to say about witches.
Yeah, she's like, excuse me.
And so the rest of the podcast now will host Leia. Go ahead, Leia. We'd love to hear from you.
Little purring ASMR.
I love that with the deer and the fae. That's going to make me look at the deer family that lives in my neighborhood a little bit differently.
Yes.
With more magic than I already feel that they have, because there is something kind of wonderful and ethereal about deer.
You're sensing the fae on them. Mm-hmm.
We have heard horror stories, though, in the paranormal realm
about the not deer.
Like,
the not deer.
Yes.
Terrifying.
Exactly. That stuff freaks me out. We've referenced the not deer before, but if this is your first time listening to an episode, or if you've listened to many other episodes where we mentioned not deer, and then we don't actually tell you what a not deer is.
Well, it's not a deer.
Probably most of them. We're going to give you a really quick hit.
Smack you in the face with a not deer.
Yeah. So essentially a not deer is not a deer. It's a cryptid. So people will spot this deer or what they think is a deer, but something just seems off, right? Like it's slightly larger. Its eyes look peculiar. Sometimes it has antlers, but the antlers look just not right. And sometimes these not deer are seen eating dead animals, which is absolutely not the traditional appetite of a deer. It's almost as if this deer is not a deer at all, but something wearing deer skin and trying to appear like an innocent deer. It might have the appearance of the deer, but sometimes if you really look closely, you'll notice that the bones and the ribs of this thing are sticking out. Like it's like dead, basically. It's being worn.
It reminds me of like in Harry Potter when Voldemort is drinking the unicorn blood.
Yeah. Silvery blood. I kind of wanted to taste it. It looked kind of good.
Excuse me? What did you think it tasted like? What do you associate it with?
I don't know.
Okay.
That's what I want to find out.
Like a fruit roll up or like what?
No, I feel like it would taste almost like almond extract.
Okay.
I also want to taste that sludge on the Teletubbies.
I definitely do not. Oh, man. I'm not a gooey, liquidy, oozing, curious person.
Oh, I guess it's like milkshake.
You are.
Yeah. I love liquids. Okay, so the not deer will also move in an unnatural way. So if you watch this thing for long enough, not only will you start to be like, what is that a deer? Like, what is that? But its body movements will kind of give it away as not actually a natural born deer.
There was one story where someone was like, it almost looked like it was breaking its bones every time it was moving. Like,
yes.
And like its back legs were almost backwards.
Right. Yeah. Some people attribute them to being related to flesh pedestrians or windy boys, which are code names for two other creatures that we're not saying the names out loud. But there's nothing like truly horrible about spotting a not deer. It's basically like you'll have the feeling of unease. You shouldn't be there. But there's no real like attacks or death or anything related to that unless you associate them with those other creatures that I just mentioned.
It's just super unsettling. It's not something you would like to experience.
If anything, they're a sign that other stuff is happening. So they're often accompanied by strange phenomena like unexplained sounds and lights. They're mostly spotted in Asia, but they're spotted all over the world. In America, specifically the Appalachia. So that's the not deer. It's not a deer.
And I do not want to see them.
You are correct to be freaked out. Any other responses is insane.
I have 2 questions. One I want to ask before I forget it. But okay, the first one related to the not deer is there a specific cryptid or legend that you are truly scared of? And then the second question, if you were to date any cryptid, who would it be and why?
I have a t-shirt that I should have worn today. It says, Mothman is real and he is my boyfriend.
Oh.
I mean, he does have a 6-pack. When we asked our listeners that, he won, so.
He has a 6-pack and that cake. Have you seen the statue of his ass that is in Point Pleasant?
Giant tush.
Damn, I know.
Yeah.
I think if I could date one, well, if I assume if I am dating this cryptid or fae that he's going to love me and not harm me, he or she, I would like a succubus girlfriend, but I would date a Grim Reaper boyfriend.
Ooh.
I actually love the Grim Reaper.
I love the Grim Reaper also. My books end up being queer because everything is queer. But ones that I'm afraid of, there are places where the veil is just thinner. And I know that's a hot button topic on Witch Talk, where a lot of people will insist that the veil has no thinness or thickness. And it can be a point of contention when people insist like the veil is thinner. But I have a pretty strong argument for why the veil is thinner in some places.
Let's hear it.
And that is the nope wall.
What's that?
Thank you. Thank you for asking. I don't know what to tell you. The nope wall is just our brains refusing to perceive something that we don't believe in. One of my favorite examples of this is in pop culture. It's in the book Name of the Wind, where the bartender has a faun who is his barkeep helper. And the faun is not using glamour magic. He's walking around with like his hooves and fur from the knee down. But everyone perceives him to just be wearing boots because their brain will not accept the idea that a faun is walking around. They see a man. They see a handsome man. That is their nope wall. And this idea of the nope wall is like, we're just not going to see things that would fuck with what our preconceived notions. So I do think that the veil is thinner in the sense that if you believe the veil is thinner on the winter solstice, then that collective belief allows your nope wall to come down and you actually will be more likely to perceive things.
Sure.
And then when it comes to specific places or locations, since the nope wall is so deconstructed in the Appalachian Mountains, I would say that most of the cryptids and fae there, since they are given a lot more empowerment of people believing in them, I would be a lot more afraid of everything going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk about that all the time. That's like one place that I would never go alone.
But you make an interesting point because I've always felt like because we hear of so many cryptids and so many spirits and just entities that exist within the Appalachia, it's made me think that there was a higher concentration of creatures and monsters, ghouls that are living there. But to your point, it might just be because they're more accepted there, that there are more experiences there. But that could be possible really anywhere.
I think there are places where like, the land is dead here. Like there are places where you feel like there's no magic.
Yeah.
But with a lot of places, it really is just a ton of people here have lack of acceptance. Whereas when you're in the Pacific Northwest and you're wandering around like redwood forests, it's a lot easier to believe in fae and magic when you're surrounded by ferns. And so your nope wall is lower.
Sure. So have you had encounters?
For those of you who are just listening on the podcast, you can't see the very cute, disarming, nondescript things I'm doing with my shoulders and facial expressions. With my TikTok presence, talking about folklore, and I've kind of switched from TikTok to gravitating towards Instagram because it's less toxic and hostile.
Yeah.
I try to keep it to the academic discipline because there are times where I feel like I don't want to lose my credibility as an academic because I'm leaning into my personal experiences. But I do believe in literally all of it. And I think that we will have scientific explanations for a lot of them. And I talk about the multiverse theory and the dimensions, not in like a aliens conspiracy type way, but in a way that physicists have already identified several dimensions. The fourth is usually agreed upon to be time. And then the fifth would be possibly what we consider things behind the veil. So things going on in that dimension, which sounds like pseudoscience, but I really feel like 800 years from now, us and the Fae will be sharing a glass of wine going, you remember when we couldn't access this dimension and everyone thought it was so funny.
More like when we couldn't access the dimension, because I fully believe a lot of other, they all
actually, know. I'm going to draw. So this is great because podcasts are wonderful for drawing.
We have a YouTube version. People can watch the video.
I'll describe to listeners what I'm doing. Right now, I'm drawing a smiley face on a piece of paper, and this is the second dimension. So two-dimensional objects cannot interact with me in the third dimension, but I, in the third dimension, can absolutely interact with them. In fact, I can punch through. And so not only can I harm them, but they can perceive me at that point, and it seems like God coming through, like, oh my God, what's happening? Now, does it have to be something malevolent? It could be something curious, something that's just idly interested. Could be like serial killers. Could be like Jane Goodall studying the gorillas. Like, just like there are different personalities of people that could interact with the second dimension, there are so many different personalities of things in the fifth dimension when it comes to the way they interact. So when people ask, like, are the Fae good or bad? They are morally neutral the same way that humans are morally neutral. It just depends on what you come across and what sort of mood it's in.
Yeah. Have you come across any people or stories that you feel are so authentic, like a neighbor or a friend or just another person online who tells a story and you're like, that feels so spot on to everything that I know? I feel with all certainty in my soul that that person experienced the Fae.
Yeah, I've had a couple of these. One was not too long ago. I think last year I was visiting a friend who had just moved to Memphis, and she called a mutual friend of ours who is very clairvoyant. She said, I just feel like there's an entity in this house. Could you like do a scan? And we were over the phone. So in my mind, I'm like, how could you possibly know? Mm-hmm. This girl who had never been to this location, who had no idea what she was looking at, like went into her mind's eye and what she said, the astral plane. And she started describing the entire house and things that we like were seeing in that moment. She's like, in the top left, it looks like a shadow was casting there and the window's not hitting, like the way that she was just physically in the house with us, even though she was across the continent.
That's so cool.
And the things she was describing, she's like, there's this flower that looks like it's growing right outside that doesn't belong there, a non-native flower. Is it something that maybe the previous owner had left there? Like she went into it to such detail and then found the quote unquote entity that was like, okay, this seems like it's nonviolent, but it's upset that you're there. And so what you're sensing is that he's just mad that you're in his territory. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you just come across people who are so clairvoyant that you're like, well, it would be really impressive if you were making this up. I would love to figure out how you do your party trick. But
yeah, how do you get that many things right?
But also a person like that, it is hard because it's like, you're just never going to convince that type of person.
If you're a skeptic, then you don't have to believe it, and that's fine. But just more cool stuff for us.
Yeah. Like, I don't know if you've encountered this, and I'm sure there's a fine line between trying to focus on like credibility and like everything you've studied and what you know versus what you believe. Have you found people who like really challenge you and it's like they're just not even worth debating with because they just want to prove themselves right?
I am pretty good at knowing my audience. And so if I know I'm with a skeptic, I'm not there to even discuss the belief element. We can just go into like, oh yeah, well, folklore is belief of the folk. It's how we make sense of the world. And sometimes you make sense of these things by you telling these stories. Like the Bermuda Triangle is a great example because whether you believe in aliens abducting ships and planes, or if we're just telling the stories because there really are some very strange currents that happen when the Gulf Coast meets the ocean there, and the way that the waves turn, it creates these super waves that are unnatural in other parts of the ocean. And I don't mean supernatural. I just mean it is a legitimately dangerous place to go. Sure. And so we create these folk tales for wisdom. Like the belief or fear in aliens is helping us avoid some place where the currents change.
Sure.
And I can still talk about folklore with people who are not interested in ever thinking about the supernatural in a serious way. And there are a lot of facets to it that I would actually say a lot of people in the folklore department don't believe in the fantastical or the preternatural.
You have all the background to have a conversation with someone like that where you can kind of default to the academics. But I feel like there are certain things I believe in so much or want to believe in that I admire you for still being able to have like a full conversation, because I feel like I would just default, there's a Robin Williams quote that he said in a movie whose name I cannot remember, but he said, "I would agree with you if you were right." And I feel like that's, I would just say that to people constantly. I would agree with you if you're right, but you're wrong. So
I feel like we're also, Corinne, just of the belief that, especially if people are emailing us their encounters, like, who are we to say whether or not what they experienced is real? Like, it was real to them.
True.
Mm-hmm.
So why wouldn't we believe them? If people don't want to believe, like, that's their own prerogative. We're not going to make anyone believe. That's our stance on it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and also to your point, Piper, when you were saying, in 800 years, we might be cheersing with the Fae. I think another thing that Sabrina and I we feel like we have one foot on either side of the line, where there are certain things that we believe in wholeheartedly and other things that we are open to the possibility of believing. And it does make me think of people who are just so closed off to it, and kind of that wall that you were talking about, like the nope wall, like putting it up. How scary the world will be or could be when something big happens to them and they have no way to make sense of it.
I just can't imagine the amount of like pretentious hubris that comes with believing that I know absolutely everything there is to know and I am not open to anything else.
Right.
Like that level of egotistical, like narcissism, I don't understand that.
Yeah.
I think that is a problematic approach to life.
Agreed.
And if you don't have an open door to explanations, even if they aren't ones that you're comfortable with, then I don't know, maybe that's how they sleep better, because I'm an insomniac. So maybe they figured something out. Ignorance truly is bliss.
What are your thoughts on astral projection? Because now talking about lack of sleep or just entering the dream world, I am curious about that.
I joke about this all the time. I say that Dream Me has gainful employment because I get texts all the time that are like, you were in my dream last night giving me very serious advice about this thing in my career. And I'll wake up feeling exhausted.
That's why you don't sleep. You're not sleeping.
I'm not sleeping.
Yeah.
And so when I do fall asleep, she is out there working hard. And I wish she would just take a break. Like, why can't I just dream
right.
when I'm on a beach getting some sun? But it's always these like, man, Dream Me works hard. When it comes to astral projection, that's such a funny thing. Like little me growing up in the church, I had this very strange, specific fear that no one who is not exposed to things like this should even be afraid of. But I remember being like 8 years old and being terrified that if my soul left my body and traveled, something else would get into it. I couldn't get back in, which is a really strange, like, how would that even be on my radar to be afraid of it? I've never been able to figure out, like, did I hear about that somewhere? Did someone tell me that? What sort of inborn fear is that?
Right. Especially at such a young age.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like that knowledge came to me from like Insidious and movies like that.
Mm-hmm. I feel like fears are there for a reason. Though once in a while, I will argue, like, is this thing evil or are you just scared of it? Like I recently did a video on the Hat Man because he's perceived to be quite evil, but he's always just staring in the corner. He doesn't really interact. He doesn't steal or suck your soul from you. Like, is he evil or are you just afraid of him?
Okay, well, that's an interesting transition because we've read a lot about how the Hat Man is like inherited and like follows specific family members. Have you heard that?
An interesting thing about the sleep paralysis demon I've found is that most people won't experience it until they know about it. And once they've heard about it, they're more susceptible to it, which to me only serves for my confirmation bias about the nope wall. So as soon as they've learned about something, they no longer have that wall up. And the Hat Man very specifically, like in that shape or form, is something that I do feel has followed families or places or locations, but there is some form of it. In Newfoundland, when I was getting my master's, a handful of the people in the cohort were studying the old hag, that's the sleep paralysis demon that will specifically sit on your chest. And so I would feel like they might be in the same family of sleep paralysis demons, but demon is also a word I'm using very colloquially to mean different things, because in Hollywood, a Hollywood demon is very different from like the Ars Goetia Goetic demons, which are their own firmly defined. Those are the ones that I write about more so in the Deer and the Dragon book that's coming out with demons. But sleep paralysis demon, the Hat Man, what have you found in your readings? Like, do you feel that he is evil?
We've recently had one listener have some pretty horrifying experiences, but it is a mixed bag.
I think the majority of them were him kind of lingering. There were a couple times where people associated him with being the Grim Reaper, like witnessing him near someone who would pass soon after. And then, someone had an experience that seemed to be almost like in the astral plane with Hat Man that was really, really terrifying for them. But I think I'm curious to hear too about your beliefs in the incubus and succubus, because we've had plenty of stories that we've read that call out incubus and succubus as these really horrific, scary demons that are there to basically like assault you. But then on the other side of things, we have these really romantic examples of people
like
who
very sexy, turn on.
Yeah, super consensual sex with some sort of spirit that can't be seen, but can very much be felt.
Yeah.
That's part of, I think that we use the word demon colloquially, that I use a specific terminology for what we think of as Hollywood entities that are like draining from us. And those would just be parasites. It's a parasitic entity is how I would describe it. So all of those Hollywood style demons or things that are actively there to harm us, it's because parasites never have a symbiotic relationship. We don't see that in the animal kingdom. We don't see it in the spiritual realm. Right. Parasites are there to drain their host until their host is dead. But when it comes to incubi and succubi, people might be experiencing a sexual encounter, one of which is horrific, probably because they're encountering a parasitic entity that feeds through that aspect. But there's also the flip side of the coin that you were describing, where it could be very consensual, very interesting. Sex magic goes back thousands of years. We see it in grimoires everywhere. So it'd be interesting to try to claim that it could only be one or the other.
Well, it makes me think about the fifth dimension and the fact that we don't understand that, and even time as a dimension. Like we've discussed and clearly have no answers, but this idea that if time is not linear, which I don't think it is, like could a version of myself come back and like communicate with present me? And so if that's the case, could a future lover or like a lover from a past life come through time and visit you in a different dimension that they're coming from?
That's something that I would absolutely believe in. And I think about the way that the fifth dimension would not be subject to linear time the way that we are, since we're third dimension, which is beneath time, and fifth dimension would be beyond time. And so stepping through the fourth to get to the third from the fifth could very easily imply like it's such this Pandora's box of possibilities that just like leads me back to, can you imagine thinking you have all the answers and none of this is real? And you're just like, all that life is this matter that I see in my hands and nothing else. When the highest rate of spiritualists and believers in any scientific discipline is physics, which I think is so interesting because they get to a point, and I don't mean like a monotheistic religion. I'm not saying like physicists are full of Christians or whatever. It's just, you get to this certain point in math and science and equations where you're like, oh my God, I fucking don't know. Like we've reached a point on like studying dimensions or string theory or all of these elements, or quantum entanglement, which is just scientific fancy words for telepathy. The more you read about quantum entanglement, the more you're like, come, this is a joke. There's no way this is real. Totally real. Totally real.
So wild.
It's so wild. Yeah, they get to a point where they're like, yeah, I don't know. Seems like there's probably something else. Seems like there's something else at work that we don't know or we don't understand.
That must be such a frustrating job to be like studying something like that, where there's truly like you're trying to quantify something that we've never been capable of understanding.
Mm-hmm. Right. That would completely change the way that I was going to say the majority of the world, but realistically, I feel like the majority of the world does have a lot of strong beliefs in the supernatural, the folklore side of things, but it would kind of shatter how we move about our world from a day
Absolutely.
to day.
And most of the people who have these discoveries die in disgrace without being acknowledged. And it isn't until long after their death, they're like, oh, actually, he was spot on. Oh, oops.
Right. I mean, it just makes me think a little bit of Oppenheimer. If you guys saw that movie, just like, I'm going to butcher the science of it, but like that it had never existed to create an explosion like that with just like atoms. And
atoms, basically, when you get all down to it and you look at things at the atomic level, nothing is actually touching. And I think that is a really fascinating argument for things like astral projection and interdimensional movement, like between the third and the fifth. The fact that we look like we are solid matter, but on that molecular structure, they are not physically touching. I get to this point where I frequently feel like I'm that meme of the guy from History Channel with the crazy hair going, aliens.
Yes.
But when you're talking about these things, it's just like, I just keep going back to, listen, man, 400 years ago, she would have been burned at the stake just because she had discovered penicillin and didn't know the name of it. She was just giving people moldy bread and then they weren't dying. And so she was killed as a witch. Like, that's just how science works, is by first saying it's crazy and burning you at the stake. And then a long time later, they're like, okay, well, maybe
that was right.
We were wrong.
Yeah.
For people who are interested in folklore and studying what you studied, but maybe won't be going on to get a master's, are there a few go-to authors or websites or places that you find yourself frequenting?
The answer is a soft yes, because people ask me all the time for books, and I know what they're asking for. They want the academic and reliable nonfiction resources for the sexy things they're interested in. Like, how can I get nonfiction resources on cryptids and fae? And that's really challenging because so much of the folklore department is non-believers who are just, their papers are going to open up with like, in the Pacific Northwest, people are predisposed to seeing fuzzies. And so they're, anyway.
Sure.
For academic papers and resources, I frequent JSTOR. It's JSTOR on the Google Academics. The American Folklore Society has a lot of papers as well that are publicly available. But I've compiled a 4-book series on nonfiction that I'm just waiting. Like, I'm hoping that these other books sell well enough, because I'm selling well in fiction, but I really want to publish the nonfiction that is what people are asking for.
Right.
I just need to prove that I can transfer a fan base over. I'm like, listen, they want to know.
Yeah.
I have all of the evidence that they want to know. But to have that academically based stuff, because we are looking for answers, and folklore is nice because it's not organized religion. It's not someone telling you what to believe. It's just like collections of stories.
Right.
And I will still put together a syllabus eventually and be like, here it is. Here are some books that you might like.
Are there any creatures or legends that most people wouldn't know about that you're just like obsessed with, that you love?
Selkies are my favorite, and I bring them up all the time. And every time I do a video on selkies, it doesn't perform at all because no one cares about selkies. But let's see, ones that I really, really like. The way that I organize a lot of my videos, if you've watched the TikTok series, is that I like to tackle things based on ability versus the actual name of the creature or by region. And so things like, I think Mothman is a banshee, and here's my evidence for how banshees are death omens, not the one who kills you. Mothman was a death omen who showed up as a precursor to death. And drawing these connections to things that happen in different regions around the world is more compelling to me than like doubling down on one specific creature or name or location. Because we're having these universal experiences. We're just giving different language to them.
Sure.
Right. And you add a different perspective too. It's like we can only hear the legend of Mothman so many times, and understanding or I guess being presented a new way of thinking about this creature is just really fascinating. And I guess that's part of the scientific field too, right? It's like we're always trying to figure out what's next, figure out if we got things correct. And I think that easily can translate over to the paranormal world as well. And all of the creatures that we think we have some characteristics and we think that we know what happened, but perhaps we don't. And with time, we can collect some of those answers. We actually recently did our first overnight like paranormal investigation at the Conjuring House this past fall. And we had 2 like full-time paranormal investigators, Greg and Dana Newkirk. Dana's also a practicing hedge witch, and she has her own coven, and they bring in a ton of knowledge. But they were recently discussing with us how it's so strange with the paranormal that you'll get pieces of information delivered to you, like what you need to know, but it's not necessarily in a linear line. Like you'll get something 4 years in the future that you needed to answer a question you had 12 years before. And it just seems like all out of place. And it is just, I don't know where I'm going with this, but the whole world of the paranormal is just so interesting. And I do find it fascinating that there are so many different cultures and legends where people tried to create these legends, create these creatures to give some warnings to their culture. But then I feel like they're juxtaposed with all of these encounters that we hear about where it's like, people were just on a train going through Colorado and they see a Bigfoot crouching in the mountain. And it's like, well, what is that? What's the lesson in that? I don't know.
I think they can go back to, I like to just compare how many different personalities of people there are. Like, you might have that fun uncle, and then you might learn that your third cousin was a serial killer. And so like, you can't guarantee that just because you came from the same family, you all have the same personalities.
Right.
So if we're thinking in terms of maybe things that belonged in the fifth dimension or cryptids or fae, maybe someone was just wandering because he was curious. Maybe your drunk Uncle Bigfoot just stumbled out of his location and was wandering around near train tracks until Aunt Susan, who is the sober one, is like, oh my God, Bigfoot, get back where you belong.
Right.
Like possibly there's no lesson there. Possibly they're just curious or wandering or exploring or on a little drunken adventure.
Like, who's to say they always have all the control? Like, I feel like they could just like accidentally like, oh, whoops, accidentally came to this dimension real quick, need to go back.
And if you're accidentally somewhere, there's often an element of panic and not acting like your best self. So if they don't want to be here, they might be clawing to get back to where they belong. And then you're not going to have a positive encounter or experience with them.
Right. What are your thoughts on aliens?
I guess once you believe in some of it, you kind of believe in all of it. But for me, I think that there's so much fae lore that looks identical to alien lore, like especially when we look at indigenous cultures. And I've used the example of how Slender Man was by name like a 2007, 2008 creepypasta internet thing. But there is this identical type creature who we have like the Dark Watchers in the 1500s when the Spaniards first arrived in California. And then there's an identical creature in Russia that we see in like the 1300s. And this character that is like Slender Man looks very much like the alien Greys. And they're also frequently just watching or loitering or lingering, kind of like the Hat Man. And so some ufologists have this theory about the Hat Man as well, that it could just be the Greys or the Watchers. Who is... My favorite funny theory is maybe he's wearing a hat because their heads look funny because they're aliens.
Like a disguise.
They're trying not to alarm us because they just have like funny bodies and funny heads. My head is pointy. I'll put on a bowler hat so as not to alarm the little human.
No one will know the difference. Very much human looking, right?
Yeah. When someone talks about alien legends and aliens lores, I would say that as a believer in the supernatural, I believe everything that they're saying. I feel like that it is a fae explanation, or that interdimensional thing is just overlapping, like where it could be the same creature. So maybe there are no fae or ghosts. Maybe it's all aliens and vice versa. Maybe it's all fae and ghosts and cryptids and no aliens. But whatever it is, I kind of think it's the same thing.
Right. There's so many connections between all of them.
Okay, guys. There's another theory about aliens, and that is that we are the aliens.
I love this theory. You told me about this theory.
I regurgitated it from what I was just seeing online.
And I love it.
But essentially, it's the suggestion that when we see aliens, when we see these traditional Greys that are like these, bulbous heads and kind of have that human figure and the big eyes.
Dark eyes.
Yes, that it's actually us from the future, that something has happened, and maybe the way that the world is going right now in terms of pollution and global warming and stuff, it suggests that perhaps we do end up living in this kind of like veil of darkness, and we become
underground.
Underground or nocturnal creatures that have these really big eyes. Our skin starts to get a little more grayish and silvery because we're not spending time in the sun.
We're kind of like worms. If we're like underground, we kind of become worm-like. And
we're becoming
if we build our bunker with our lazy river, we're going to be spending a lot more time in the water.
True.
So
we're slippery. We need no hair.
Slippery little aliens.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we just wanted to add that extra theory because a bunch of theories were just thrown around about what aliens could be, but we missed one of them, and it being
this one.
They're us.
Us. I think growing up, I used to get very bored of history, but now as I've gotten older and in doing all the podcast research, I'm just so fascinated by history and like historical documents. Do you get to or do you ever go to places to try to find like archives and original documents and old texts to try to study and find similar stories?
It's definitely a lot more fun now. Like when I was in grad school, I did a lot of crying and laying on the floor because graduate work is not fun. It's how can I get a master's in folklore? Don't do it. It's horrible. But coming out on the other side and like maintaining all of my beliefs, now getting to reapproach old texts and like dusty, like leather bound books is a lot more interesting. And looking on old tales now, like, is this just supposed to be a tale on behavioral control and modification for children? Or are there other elements that we're seeing that aren't rooted in like parents made up this story so that kids will go to bed on time? Are there other things that we're seeing? So I love historical documents. Who doesn't love a good dusty book? And it's really interesting that our crow brains seem to have this commonality where if we find like a really cool, creepy old book, we all want to buy it. What is that?
Right.
It's just like I need knowledge.
Yeah. And the smell of it, it draws us in. They quite literally bottle up that scent now and sell it as candles.
Yeah.
Old books.
As much as I wish we could teleport, I feel like that's the closest we can get to it. Like you're truly interacting with something that has traveled through time in a way that other things haven't.
Yeah. I have a very witchy theory, and you guys are getting kind of the witchiest version of me on this podcast for this episode, because generally I try to stay as academic as possible, but this time I'm like, YOLO, here's what I believe. When it comes to our attraction to really old texts and books and knowledge and what you'd said about teleportation and things like that, I have this operating belief that our brains are sort of like sandboxes or Scrabble pieces where if someone is communicating, be it a ghost or a fae or maybe a deity they work with, if you're a witch or a practitioner, they can only use the Scrabble pieces that are available in your brain. And so if you feel compelled, like, I need to read this book, suddenly there are more words and language that they can play with when communicating to you or with you. And again, that's a very witchy take of mine, but it's just like, maybe they can't give you information with words that you've never heard before.
Sure. Well, it kind of goes back to what you were just saying, Corinne, about like Greg and Dana, where getting information or having a question or something happened to you like 12 years ago, and then something new happens in present day that you all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, like you connect those two things from such a different time period, but like you didn't have all the information. You didn't have all of the experience to put those together until this moment.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like building a language to be able to interact with the universe and all different aspects of it.
Yeah.
We work our entire lives to try to create as big of one as we can. Well, some of us. The three of us here.
The three of us too. Exactly.
It's scary. I mean, even just having this conversation, it's like we're talking about such big things that don't have answers, that are just so open-ended, that as people with anxiety, like sometimes that to me is like, it's hard to like reground myself and be like, okay, well, like, let me just stand here, feel my feet on this earth and be like, I don't have the answers to that. But I also think being open to all of that makes me feel a little bit happier about life. Like it's not just this, because this life can be miserable sometimes. So I'm like, I have to believe that there's more.
It can. And that's important to find that sense of community. Like back in the 1100s, you would get your little micro covens because witches needed to be able to talk to each other about the things they were experiencing. And today we have Two Girls, One Ghost podcast so that you can bring together people who believe in paranormal and supernatural so that they form that sense of community so you don't feel like you're losing your mind or going crazy. And then self-plug book clubs for people who are like, did you read this book about demons and fae? Let's form a community around that so that we don't feel crazy.
Right.
Grounding yourself with people who also tell you that you're not insane can be really validating.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, can I just say, I know that you like tend to lean more into the educational and like factual part of folklore, but you give the most major, and I mean this in like the most complimentary way, you give the most major witch vibes ever.
Thank you. There's times sometimes like I never talk about my personal practice or beliefs because I want to stay credible in academic fields, but I'll text my agent something like, I heard this in meditation. She'll be like, what the fuck? I got an email about this 1 hour ago. There is no way that you know about this. I'm like,
ooh.
They just told me.
Yeah. You're picking up on it.
Yeah.
You're reading the waves being sent through.
Well, if you ever need a community to, even if it's like anonymously, to like divulge your experiences and just have people to like understand and relate to, this is it. And it's such an accepting community. We can do a voice changer in a future episode. Like, put a hat on. No one will recognize you.
No one will recognize you. Yeah, just wear a bolo hat and you'll be fine. Well, Piper, it was so great to have you on. We've been watching you on TikTok for a couple of years now. So it's nice to be together, even though we're still through a screen. But now it's a two-way conversation instead of us, Sabrina and I, conversating and sending your videos back and forth. Being like, oh my God.
This was a blast. I had so much fun. I hope you guys will have me back on in the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Definitely stay in touch so that we can all bond over super secret things that we're not allowed to tell the world or whatever.
Let's all travel to the 5th dimension and have wine with the Fae, because that would be a lovely time.
Well, as a safety plug, we're not supposed to drink Fae wine or eat of their food or give them our names or say thank you. But I guess that's why you have to have me back on, because I didn't include any of my safety messages for dealing with the Fae. So we'll do that next time.
If I were to die by drinking Fae wine, that sounds way more interesting than the alternate human ways to die.
Well, who's to say you die at all?
Death is rarely the outcome.
I'll live in their world. That's fine.
It's also rarely a fun environment. It's usually and now you're stuck being their blood bag for them to munch on for the rest of eternity, and not in a hot way, not in a Planet of the Ice Barbarians or hot Fae Lord taking you as his bride way. It's usually oh great, now I'm his little snack.
I'm imagining the little souls in a Little Mermaid, like Ursula's little worms.
Yes. There we go. That
poor unfortunate souls.
Mm-hmm. Those are the ones.
Okay.
And if Disney hasn't copywritten it, we should do an outro of poor unfortunate souls, and then that's the end of the
episode. We'll do the voice changers so that they won't know it's us, so they can't sue us.
Yeah. That's how that works.
And thank you again for having me on. This was so fun. You guys are a blast.
Thank you. It was so fun. Thanks, Piper.
Let's I was going to say, let's have wine in the Fae realm soon, but I just finished saying we shouldn't do that. So
we'll bring our own wine in the Fae world.
Smart.
Yeah, bring our own wine or have it in this world and invite them together here.
I'll see you tonight in the astral realm.
There we go. That's it.
Dream me will come visit.
Honestly, I'm going to try. I'll do my best.
I'll try too. Well, until then.
Bye, friends.